kick off. Hello, everyone. So whether you're watching us live or you're viewing the archive later on, welcome to Hacking HR's HR Innovation and Future of Work Global Digital Conference. You're in one of the first panels running on the first day on this new system, Hopin, that has been keeping us all entertained so far. And this panel is focusing on culture. So culture, the key ingredient of a strong organisation. My name is John Ingham. I'll be the moderator for this panel. And just in terms of Hopin, as I was just saying, but for those of you who are just joining, we will be taking questions later on. So please do ask your questions in the chat window as we progress, or indeed anything else that you want to say or ask or talk about. We'll be keeping an eye on that. So culture. Culture eats strategy for breakfast, as most of us know, supposedly said by management guru Peter Drucker. Probably the most famous quote used to explain this. Oh, and we've got Siobhan joining as well. I'll just give you a couple of minutes to settle in, Siobhan. Good to see you. So that's the most famous quote, but I'd like to kick off with a slightly different one. You may know that Jack Welch, former chief executive at General Electric and the original combined business leader and guru, died this weekend. While best known for very hard financially based management practices, in a Fortune article after he'd left GE, Welch suggested, soft culture matters as much as hard numbers. And if your company's culture is to mean anything, you have to hang publicly those in your midst who would destroy it. It's a grim image, we know. But the fact is, creating a healthy, high integrity organization culture is not for puppies and rainbows. And yet, for some reason, too many leaders think a company's values can be relegated to a 5-minute conversation between HR and new employees. An organization's culture is not about words at all. It's about behavior and consequences. It's about every single individual who manages people knowing that his or her key role is that of the chief values officer. It's about knowing that at every performance review, employees are evaluated for both their numbers and their values. I think that describes the opportunity quite nicely, except that I think we can go beyond that too. So today, culture isn't just something that supports business success. It's not just the soft stuff that supports the hard numbers. It is what creates the numbers. It's not just part of the recipe. It really is the key ingredient. But what is culture? And I know that not all of us as panelists are necessarily going to agree on that. How do we measure it? How do we ensure it's going to drive a strong organization? How do we develop and optimize it? So all of these questions and more we're going to respond to on this panel. So, and I think we've lost Siobhan again, and hopefully she might be joining us later on. But yeah, if we start, well, perhaps let's sort of travel through the time zones. So start on Pacific time in lovely, I'm not sure if the sun's actually up yet, Stephen, but in lovely California.
It is up. Sunlight coming through the windows here.
Wonderful. Do you want to say hello and introduce yourself and your work and whatever?
Yes, thank you, John. So my name is Steve Chaparro, and I am from Long Beach, California, which is just outside Los Angeles. And I am the founder of Culture Design Studio, which is a firm in which we help creative organizations transform their workplace culture through co-creative or collaborative design. And so if you imagine an architect who goes from designing building to a facilitator.
Thank you, Stephen, and you obviously talk more about that a little bit later on. Can I just say we're getting quite a bit of feedback on the line. So if anybody, well, any of our panelists, if you've got the volume on loud, can you mute while other people are talking, please? Thank you, Stephen, that was wonderful. And continuing our travel through the time zones to equally beautiful Florida. Juan, do you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. My name is Juan Betancourt. I'm the CEO of Humantelligence. We're the first company that claims to measure culture accurately manage culture and help a company hire for culture fit, which leads to better performance. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Some of you may be expecting Britt Provost, who's the Executive Vice President of People and Culture at Accolade in Seattle, to join as well. Unfortunately, Accolade have got an interesting time at the moment, so she's not able to join us currently. Oh, yes, me. So I'd introduce myself as John Ingham, strategic HR consultant based in Berkshire in the UK. I help HR functions be more innovative, perhaps using technology, keeping up to date with the future of work and new opportunities to align with their own strategy. I don't really talk about culture very much, so this is going to be an interesting session for me. I'll explain why I don't a bit later on, but everything I do is about what we'll be talking about today, so looking forward to the conversation. And then finally, as we travel around the world, actually talking about the future of work, we're now traveling into tomorrow for the rest of us, so it's Wednesday already in Melbourne. Hi, Siobhan.
Hello, welcome. Hello from Melbourne, Australia, where it's actually in the middle of the night here.
Have you got your coffee ready? Or something stronger, maybe?
Yeah, so I'm, in terms of introductions, I'm the Executive General Manager of People, Culture and Change at DuluxGroup, which is an international paints company based in Melbourne, Australia.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so everybody is now introduced, and hello to everybody on the who's viewing and on the chat as well. Please do introduce yourselves as well. But we're going to dive right into our agenda. And as I was saying, you know, different people have different perspectives about culture. So it probably makes sense just to start with that and try to understand a little bit more about what we're talking about. And Siobhan, as our, without Britt, obviously our sort of one senior HR practitioner and someone who has just written the book on culture as well. Could we start with you? Your thoughts on what is culture?
Yeah. For me, culture is the patterns of thinking and relating that determine how the organization functions. So in simple terms, it's how things work around here. And I often say that culture is one of the most talked about but most sort of misunderstood concepts in workplaces today, because I think it sits at the collective level. So often we think about, or we talk about cultures in terms of values and behaviors, and yes, obviously they are an important aspect of culture, but it's a little bit like the distinction between the dancers and the dance. The dancers are the behaviors in the organization, but the dance is the pattern or the patterns or the unwritten agreements between the parts. And that's, you know, culture essentially sits at the collective level in the patterns of relating between the parts. And I think that is one of the biggest misconceptions about culture, because we tend to intervene and look at the behaviors rather than intervening and seeing the patterns that are actually the agreements that are often hidden.
Mm. And hopefully we'll get on to some of the interventions later on. So I'm going to sit this one out because I don't really sort of talk about culture very much. But Stephen and Juan, if you want to sort of pitch in and agree or disagree is appropriate.
Yeah, well, how can we respond to a person who's written a book on culture? But I absolutely agree with those definitions, and I think that idea of pattern is a beautiful thing. And I think even if you can translate a pattern, maybe even as a code, sometimes it's a written code, sometimes it's an unwritten code.
Stephen, sorry to interrupt, but you were getting quite a lot of, we had a lot of feedback over you last time we talked, and I'm just really keen that we do hear you properly. Siobhan, I think the feedback's coming from your end. Is it possible to mute yourself when you're not speaking?
Sure.
Just muted her, so she's now actually muted. I've been doing it back and forth and trying.
Oh, wow. We'll have to figure out how to do that later on as well. Thank you. So sorry, Stephen. We did catch that, but
Yeah, I think when we think of patterns, I think of also codes. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, I tend to think in metaphors many times, and I think of it many times as the operating system of an organization, where it determines what are the things that we value, what are the things that we don't value, what are the things that we are going to agree to do and not to do. I think culture is, I mean, obviously we're talking about culture in the context of HR in this particular case, but I think culture is actually encompassing more than just the employees and internal to a company. It also very much captures how we address our customers as well. So it's, part of the employee experience as well as the customer experience is everything that we value. But I think it's the actual experience that is in a company as opposed to what the company professes to do or be. I think many times from an employer brand or even from a customer facing brand, we can declare that this is who we are, this is what we do. But true culture is what is actually going on inside of an organization. Sometimes there's some things that are lying below the surface, and it takes a little bit of a shakeup to resurface those. But I completely agree with what Siobhan mentioned, and I think there's different ways of looking at it in terms of how we can use metaphors also to kind of, put some handles on that definition.
Perfect. And Juan?
Yeah, so I also agree with both Siobhan and Steve, and I've been blessed that my company actually measures those things. So yes, Siobhan is correct. It's how things work around here. And how things work is an environment, a very structured environment where everybody uses data and structured methods and proven methods, or is it a really innovative environment that's creative with no structure and it's all shoot from the hip? Very different, how things work experience. But then it also is, as Siobhan mentioned, behaviors, and what Stephen mentioned to add to that, not just behaviors, but motivators and values of people. And those are measurable now too. So if you want a real easy way of knowing what culture is, to break it down, okay, it's your people, their psychology, and how they work. Okay, and it's not the same all over the world, and it's not the same at one company. This concept of one culture at a company is actually crazy, and if you actually had one culture at your company, you would fail miserably because you don't want your finance and accounting people to work and have the same values and behaviors as your marketing people, as your sales people. Okay, Starbucks is a great example. The barista and team of baristas at Starbucks in Hialeah, which is a suburb of Miami, where it's all Cuban and Venezuelan immigrants, the customers and the employees talk about experience that Stephen brought up. Okay, what leads to a high net promoter score, the culture within a Starbucks of high performance in that store in Hialeah, means the Starbucks barista touching the customers, picking up their babies, talking for 10 minutes. The experience might be 30 minutes before you leave that store. And that's an amazing cultural experience for both the employees and the customers. You put that high-performing Starbucks employee or baristas in New York City, where they're touching employees, asking personal questions, taking 30 minutes, that Starbucks store would close in a month and probably get sued. So you actually have different cultures. So to summarize, if you want to take it from concept to what actually culture is, which is actually measurable, think of BMW. Behaviors, motivators. Motivators are basically another way of saying the values of people, okay? And work styles. What work environment do they create? Okay, it doesn't matter what the company writes, on the company entrance door, on the t-shirts or coffee mugs. Bottom up is the way culture should be measured and be seen, not top down. And it is your people, their psychology and how they work, or otherwise simply put, BMW, behaviors, motivators.
Perfect. Siobhan, I can see you're wanting to come in on that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that both Juan and Steve and yourself have talked about, but I also think there is a collective nature in culture that actually can sometimes transcend across the whole, and we often don't see this. So let me give you an example to bring it to life. So one of the transformations I've been involved in was a 7-year journey at ANZ Bank, where when I joined in the early 2000s, it was the worst performing bank in the country. And within 7 years, it became one of the top performing banks in the world and actually #1 on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. But what we did when we walked into the bank was see a pattern of relating between the head office and the 700 branches. So head office was in role of order giver, and they gave directives to the branches about how to deliver customer service. And the branches were in role of order taker. And between them, you had this circular pattern or agreement that you are to blame for the poor customer service. And this pattern of relating was going around and around, where each part, the head office was blaming the branches, and the branches was blaming the head office for the poor customer service. So if we hadn't seen the pattern, we would have intervened at the level here. We would have rolled out customer training courses for the branch staff. But seeing the pattern led us to a different solution. And we actually implemented a new operating model and reframed the role of head office from order giver to service provider to the branches. And we reframed the role of the branches from order taker to service provider to the customer. So the new operating model started to shift the roles and the rules of engagement, or the relatedness between the parts. And that was the key that led to the transformation of the bank from the worst performing bank in the country to one of the highest and best regarded banks in the world. So I think where, yes, behaviors are obviously, they really matter, but often the patterns of relating the agreements between the parts are the invisible components that we miss. And because we miss them, we put in interventions that become a problem, maybe not a solution.
Perfect. And obviously we can talk more about all of that later. We are going to have to speed up a little bit, by the way, if we're going to get through. But just on measurement then, and Juan, obviously you sort of started on that, but anything more to add?
Yeah, actually, to take the thread from Siobhan, BMW at an individual level, your people, their psychology, and their work styles. As Deloitte, their own definition, it's about the way things get done, the behaviors, the values. So same definition that we're all talking about, but Deloitte goes further and also says it's rolling it up as a collective, cohesive whole, right? And if you can align business strategy to culture, you'll be more profitable and successful. Siobhan's example is perfect. So totally agree with Siobhan. And actually that's why our company, Humantelligence, is doing so well. We actually measure not just individuals, but because of data analytics, you can push a button and now see what Siobhan calls the invisible components. Now with data analytics, you can see across one team, one group, one division, a whole company worldwide, the roll-up of the culture bottom up, and see those patterns. See directionally if a company is more innovative or if a company is more cautious, to see if a company likes to use more new solutions versus proven methods. And so the example that she gave about the bank, we have an example from the US as well. Top 3 automaker North America losing 2 percentage points a year. Their culture was written on the walls of t-shirts, coffee mugs, like many companies do. They define it at the top and then hope everybody lives it, which is impossible. And so they had false positives, 1% turnover. So people were happy it seemed to work. Engagement surveys were 95%, okay? And yet everybody could, in the engagement surveys, memorize that the company was a creative, innovative culture. 2% market share decrease every year, 2011, 2015. We went there, we measured every person, rolled up the data, and it turned out that only 8% of the entire 10,000 employee base had anything to do with creative and innovative. There of 28 things within BMW, there are about 8 of them that measure indication of innovative, creative, either psychology or work styles. And so then we work with a consulting firm to transform the company, and they went from losing 2% market share a year to gaining 2% market share a year, and now they're seen as the top most innovative, creative company because they've now aligned the culture with their strategy, and so it's no longer the T-shirt and on the company screensavers. It's actually a measured thing that they can manage and align strategy.
Wonderful. Love another great case study. Thank you. Well, look, so because I've not commented previously. Measurement for me, and I think that's a great approach, and certainly I think to me, part of translating culture from that sort of very soft thing to something which is going to have a harder impact, measurement definitely helps to sort of understand what we're talking about. I think key points for me, firstly, I thought it was interesting that you all agree with each other, although clearly, as I'm sure you've all picked up, there are definitely nuances in the way that you were describing culture. And the first thing for me, and this isn't just about culture, but a lot of what I do around strategic HR, if we're not clear enough about what we're doing, measuring it is always really difficult to do. So the key for me is, let's really focus on being more specific, more objective about what we're trying to do, what we're trying to change, because as soon as we're clearer, measurement becomes easy or easier. And I agree that benchmarking tools definitely play a role in this. And going back to what I was saying previously, that I think culture is now the key ingredient. It's not just part of the recipe. And therefore, this thing about linking culture to what the organization needs, and I accept it needs to vary according to team and HR to finance and so on, but there should still be something which underpins it across the whole organization. And therefore culture does need to be different from organization to organization. And therefore I think to some extent organizations also need to decide how they're going to measure it to get the data which is going to be specific for us. That would be my 2 cents. Stephen.
I love the of measurement. I love analytics, and I think we should continue to do more of that as a method of listening to our employees, listening to what they're feeling, and from all of that data, be able to arrive at some insights about what is affecting the culture as a whole. But my whole thing about data is now that we have the data and now that we have insights, it's almost now what? What do we do with that? And I think the data and insights are really impactful. But I think I've worked with companies like, say, or Culture Amp or the Predictive Index that are really good companies about employers to have and gather that information. And so my question has always been, once you have that data, how are you going to arrive at solutions after that? And so I think I'm always thinking of the next thing. Information and research is good, but when you come up with solutions, who are you going to go to for those solutions? Is the executive suite going to be the group or the layer of the organization that has those solutions, or you can have third-party consultants? Or are you going to go back to the employees to maybe co-develop what some of those solutions might be moving forward? And I think that's a little bit going into the next topic. And I don't know if we're ready to go into that next topic. I don't know if Siobhan, if you had some insights about measurement as well.
Just a quick one on measurement, and it's more from an insider perspective, but I see a lot of HR professionals focusing almost primarily on employee experience in terms of their definition of culture. And I think we've got to really broaden that out to other stakeholders. If you're an executive team, executives these days that I'm talking to want to know, how can I create a growth culture, an innovative culture, a customer service culture, a strategic culture, a performance-focused culture? So we've got to have solutions for other cultural ambitions, not just about employee experience.
Great. Okay, so Stephen, yes, let's move on to the co-development piece.
Yeah, what I love about the idea of involving employees in the co-development of some of these solutions, I mean, that's really the passion and the underpinning of all of our work. I've worked at creative agencies, I've worked at international real estate development companies, and I think there's this concept that describes the world that we're living in, and that's the VUCA world, a world where that is much more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous than ever before. So best practices and the knowledge and experience that we have based on what we have done in the past will many times no longer work moving forward. So there is no way that an executive team or even a third-party consultant can quickly understand what are all the great insights that need to be gathered, but also what are some of the ideas that you could possibly implement moving forward. So I'm of the absolute opinion that being able to invite employees into a process where we can harness, we can collect what I call the collective views of our company, of our employees. I actually believe that the greatest subject matter experts of the culture and the solution to remedy cultural issues are the employees. And so the idea of using methodologies of design thinking and co-creation is a really powerful thing, because I think one of the main problems that this co-development process offers is actually greater engagement by the employees, also greater innovation to the solutions that they can bring to the table. Whether that's a primary or secondary goal of the process, I think the higher engagement of the employees is a powerful thing.
Siobhan, anything to add? But can we keep it quick, please?
Yeah, culture is co-created. So, you know, leaders, managers, employees, people at all levels have a role to play in terms of creation of culture. So you can't not include employees in that, because they must bring the new culture, desired culture, to life in their parts of the business. So for me, it's a no-brainer what Stephen is saying. You must include employees, because if you don't, then they're not going to bring the aspirational culture to life in their parts of the business.
Perfect, thank you. And I'm going to chip in on this as well. So again, a lot of my work is sort of broader strategic HR. And look, I just think this applies to everything that we do these days, whether it's culture or anything else. I think organizations, life, business has changed. The days of the chief executive being able to stand up in front of everybody and say, here's our new business strategy, everyone go and do this for us. It just doesn't work anymore. You know, we've moved from a focus on trust and authority to one around social influence. You know, we trust, we engage, we're influenced by the people that we network with at a sort of a more equal level to us. So the way that we get traction is to be human, is to bond, is to grow a shared social identity between us and the people that we're talking about. And if we don't do that, I don't think anything happens. You know, how else would you do culture other than trying to do it together with your employees? And I think also, actually, particularly in culture, to me, it's always the process that's more important than the result, in a sense. So it's you know, it's how you go around doing this, how you frame it, the conversations that you're having that are probably more important than whatever you end up with. So, you know, co-development, absolutely the way to go. Completely agree. We were going to have Britt at this point talking about being a cultural anthropologist. And if you have a look on Britt's LinkedIn site, she's sort of been talking about being really interested in sort of exploring the territory in an organization in the way that an anthropologist does. So we've not got Britt, but perhaps just sort of a minute each just to respond to her topic. What is HR's role in all of this? So we've talked about what culture is, how we measure it, how we work with employees to develop it. What should HR be doing? What's the role? What are the responsibilities? Yeah, whoever wants to take that first.
I'll jump in. So basically, I believe that culture is like strategy. It permeates the whole organization, and having one central function telling everyone what the culture is or what everybody what their strategy should be fails miserably. And so just like when you do your planning cycle at the beginning of the year, there's a general vision and strategic direction the company goes, but then every division, every function, every region, they develop bottom up their own strategies based on that guidance. And so culture should not be run by HR. That's again top down. That never works. And also, the one disagreement I have with the panel is you should not be looking at culture from all of your employees, right? If you want a culture of innovation and you have lazy people at the bottom and you're not being innovative as a company, asking them what the company should be, they should say, oh, we shouldn't innovate so much. So these engagement surveys and asking for feelings, right, they've had zero impact after 2 billion engagement surveys on performance and on turnover, right? What we're learning is engagement surveys have nothing to do with culture. That's why nobody ever uses the insights in recruiting for culture fit. What you do need, though, is a bigger selection of your employees. Who are the people put in strategy? Well, every planning cycle, you have your middle management team. Your culture will be defined not only through execution, but through hiring of people to align to your culture by your team leader. So we firmly believe, and the data shows, once it's been measured, that the culture and the success of aligning culture to top level strategy is at the team level. And so there are tools, ours is one of them, where a team leader can say, here's my actual culture of my team. Here's what I want to achieve the next 2 years as a culture. The gap is 20%, 80%. Here's how each person needs to be developed and changed. So it's a culture roadmap. So just like you have a strategy roadmap for the year, a technology roadmap, a product roadmap, you should have a culture roadmap for every team leader and their teams. And there's now software that allows you to quickly, in 5 minutes, build out what your strategy culture should be, and then have a roadmap on how you develop your people and maybe also hire people to align that. So it's not only just measurable, it's now manageable.
Brilliant. Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the leadership, whether it's HR and HR as part of executive team, I think that early on in the growth of a company, that they need to act almost as an architect of culture initially, to be able to say, here is our roadmap, here is our strategy, this is where we want to go, and here are the steps that we need to accomplish in order to get there. However, I think that as a company matures, the more and more the executive or leadership team or even HR team is directing how things should look, the more and more people are going to be disengaged because they're basically being told what to do. So I think that there needs to be a transition from leadership as an architect of culture to becoming leadership as a facilitator. And that's what I mean, not necessarily by saying, you know, let's do a survey and see what you guys want, but it's about facilitating a process of engagement to be able to allow some of those things to bubble up and try to understand, because I think really the employee is given the opportunity to help, one, in response to what leadership is saying from, here's what we aspire to be, but I'm going to leave it up to you employees to help and give a voice as to what that could and should look like, to give flesh to that spoken word. Then I think a facilitated process is really a big part of that, as opposed to just being directed what to do. Because as newer and younger generations enter the workforce, they're not going to be tolerated being told what to do. They want to have a voice what that looks like.
Absolutely. Siobhan.
I've joined organizations where people have said to me, thank goodness you're here and good luck with changing the culture. Got to move away from that myth that HR is responsible for fixing the culture. Actually, culture change is leader-led, and leaders and managers at all levels need to step into their role to shape the culture in their areas of responsibility. Now, HR has a leadership role, and I actually think HR has two critical roles in organizations. The first is as a business leader around the management table, as a peer with its colleagues. It is an equal business leader with deep expertise in people, culture, and change. And this is one of the reasons I've written my book, is that I wasn't seeing enough rigor around the methodology that some HR folk were taking into the management table about how do you create faster change with noise, and how do you make culture much more commercial. So culture is not about feel good. Culture is actually about the delivery of the strategic imperatives and goals of the organization. And that's the conversation that HR needs to be engaged in, with its deep people, culture, and change expertise, helping to shape that change strategy and helping to engage the whole organization and make the roles clear, because lack of role clarity is one of the biggest issues why change, and in particular culture change, does not succeed. People don't understand their roles.
Perfect. Wonderful. And particularly wonderful for me, because it means that I can disagree finally, because I've been a bit disappointed about how much agreement there's been so far. You know, a little bit of disagreement, but I'm going to ramp it up a bit now. Although in a sense I do agree, and this is mainly architect, facilitator, business leader, completely agree with all of that. And actually also the comment about responsibility, I agree with. I, however, do suggest that HR can be, and if I was still an HR director today, I would want to be accountable for culture, because I think we can do much more. Now, it is a strange form of accountability. So it's accountability without responsibility, because we're not responsible. We can't do it on our own. But culture is so important. You know, it drives the business. We've been talking about that. And why, as an HR director, wouldn't I want to take accountability for the things which are most important in the organisation? So I would, you know, I'd work out what are the things that are important, what are the things we're trying to create, and I'd commit to achieving them. Now, I agree, I can't do that all on my own, but I have a vast array of levers at my disposal. There are loads of different things I can do. So I can train the leaders to lead their people in different ways. If that doesn't work, I can influence the sacking of the leaders. You know, there's lots and lots of different things. So again, it's not short term. It has to be a fairly long term accountability. But so, you know, this is too important just to be left. Yeah, everybody is responsible. That to me, that's not enough. And so just one more point, Siobhan, and then yes, I'll return to you. If I can remember the point. No, go on then, Siobhan. Off you go.
Okay, I will disagree with you again, because I don't think HR is accountable. I think it's co-accountable. So I think as a business leader, HR is equally accountable around the management table for the delivery of the culture imperatives, but it is around co-leadership. So around that leadership table, each person will have a different accountability, and HR cannot abrogate that responsibility. And this is what has to step into its business leader role, as well as its HR role, if you like, that people, culture and change role. So I would sort of tweak it a bit to say co-accountable, because as soon as you take accountability, the rest of the organization passion that emerges with that is, oh, okay, so Siobhan's stepping in as the head of HR. That's great. I don't have to worry about it, because the change will be done to me or done for me. And that pattern actually leads to no change. So if you understand your unique role and the unique role that each part plays, then you can step into your co-leadership role of culture.
Great. Sort of. Yeah, no, I agree. Co-leadership, absolutely. And I don't want to go too far into this, because this is a panel about culture, not one about organisation design. But for me, and I know things are changing and organisations are becoming more social, and you know, people are working more closely together, but this long-standing rule in organisation design that there's only ever one person accountable, you know, personally I still think that fits. So if you have co-accountability, you have no accountability. One person has to be accountable. Now, if that's the chief executive, who is so progressive and human focused for their organisations that they are accountable for the culture, I'm fine with that. And that makes HR's job an awful lot easier. But if the chief executive doesn't see themselves as accountable, I think HR needs to take accountability. Right, final topic. And let's try and do this relatively quickly, because we do have quite a few questions in the chat. The plan is for us to have finished by at least the top of the hour, so the o'clock. So we've got sort of 15 minutes, well, say 10 minutes to take some questions. So I have been coming at this from a slightly different perspective. Well, we've all had different perspectives, but I'm a bit of a slight cynic about culture. Again, not the things we're talking about. Everything we've been discussing is so hugely important. I just wonder whether calling it culture is still the best way to take things forward. And my reason for that is, so look, again, we've reached a level of agreement between us, but there have been disagreements. And if you have a look at all of the other definitions of culture that's around, so I was saying as part of the introduction, Jack Welch talks about values and behaviours. Clayton Christensen used to talk about culture as the emergence from practices and processes. There are so many different ways of seeing this. And again, the point I was making earlier, that if we're not clear enough about what we're trying to do, measuring the thing becomes much harder. And as an example of that, in the UK at the moment, there's a concerted effort going on to make organisations report externally on culture. Now, that's a really positive trait, because we need external investors and stakeholders and analysts to take culture much more seriously than they do. But because everyone defines culture in different ways and talks about it in different terms, I just don't think that's going to be particularly helpful. Whereas if we can try to get organisations focused on what are the things that they're doing individually, they can report much more meaningfully. So just very, very quickly, what I do. So firstly, I try to focus on the capabilities rather than the culture. And this is something that Dave Ulrich talks about as well. So he says, as an individual, your personality is an input into the habits. So your habits as an individual are based upon your individual personality. And the same thing for organizations, that the capability that we're trying to create, the qualities of our people and organization lead to the culture. Now, you can't, the culture sort of swans around and sort of does its own thing, and you can influence it, but you can't control it. But you've got a lot more control. You've got a lot more ability to influence the capabilities. So I focus on capabilities, and particularly social capital, the value of the connections, the relationships, the conversations taking place in the organization, because it's still intangible, but it's much more discrete, it's much more specific. I can frame it and understand what I'm talking about a little bit more. Just because, in case we didn't have enough controversy by this point, I thought I'd lob that in. Should we still be talking about culture? Is it the best thing to focus on? Or, like me, should we sort of break it up and think about it in different terms? Juan, I think or Siobhan.
Okay, I'll off, and I mean, I probably fundamentally disagree with you, and I'll go back to the ANZ example. you knew I would. So if we, in the ANZ Bank example, if we had been focused on behaviours and capabilities, as I mentioned before, we would have intervened very differently, because we would have tried to build out capabilities around customer service and customer focus and being good listeners and being able to serve the customers. But that wasn't the problem. The problem was the patterns or the agreement between the office and the branches, that one was the order giver and the other was the...
So you need to focus on patterns, to call it patterns, because that's what you're talking about.
Yes, so that, in my definition, that is what culture is. Now, those patterns or agreements are quite difficult to measure. I'd love to see some of Juan's data on how you measure those agreements between the parts, because I think they're very, very difficult to detect, and often we can become blind to them. And even if you ask people within the ANZ Bank what are the patterns, they wouldn't be able to tell you, because often they were unconscious. They were just the way things worked. So I would say that culture is very different. It's the difference between the dancers and the dance. The dance is the behaviours, the dance is the pattern or the agreement between the parts. And you've got to be able to distinguish those, or else they run you and you're intervening in the wrong way.
Okay. And Juan, anything to add?
I totally agree. They are missed and they are hard to see. They are invisible. So, and Siobhan, I'll show you our platform, how we do it. 2 examples. Truck company, 10,000 truckers, 3,000. We're always spending 5,000 more per year on gas. Okay, 3,000 times 5,000 is like $1.5 million. Okay, so we save them $1.5 million. How? We took the measurement of the behaviors, the motivators, the work styles, 28 things of the 3,000 truckers who always spend more money on gas, despite the same distance driven. How do you explain it? Same distance, more money spent. And what we found was that the truck driver, and then compared those truck drivers, 3,000 with the 7,000 remaining, And the truck driver, and this is the invisible part, nobody could ever see this. The truck drivers that spent more money on gas were extreme decisive, 30 units over here versus to 0 versus deliberate. Turns out at red lights, when they turn green, these truck drivers are slamming on the gas. They were extremely behavior of being decisive. And when they passed on the highway, they would be slamming on the gas. That would take more fuel inefficiency. And so they ended up spending more money. All this company did was spend $200,000 on a catalytic converter, because you can't change someone from being decisive and accelerating quickly. So you put a catalytic converter like the golf carts and the go-karts, and now those trucks drivers don't spend the money. We save them $2 million. Okay, so you can also a furniture company, largest furniture company in the world, 22,000 employees.
Okay,
They've been and turning out that they thought high-performing people who were focused on pay for performance, because their best performers made a lot of money, and they thought that people were decisive in a manufacturing process. They thought that would lead to performance.
Okay, Juan, we
performers, and they were now able to reduce turnover by 80% and save $8 million, because now they could measure what a culture performance was, and it had nothing to do with pay for performance.
Thank you. We need to move on to some of the questions, because we have been getting a lot of questions in the chat. Thank you, everybody. Stephen, you might have had a little bit less airtime recently. Anything you'd like to add to that last conversation at all?
I'm not quite understanding the question right, but I would say that it's not an either or. In my opinion, it's a both and. I think culture absolutely is something we need to focus on, but I also think that the components that contribute to the strength of culture, like capabilities and behaviors, are important as well. And so I think it's important to focus on both.
Perfect, wonderful. Right, so I've been trying to keep an eye on people's questions, and I've not managed to do that for everybody. So apologies if I don't raise your own personal question, but I do appreciate you asking them. 3 questions that I've certainly noticed in the chat, and I'm just going to raise all 3 questions, and then can we each, as panelists, respond to just one, because we're going to run out of time otherwise. So choose the question. So the first one, and in fact it's a double part question, this one. So this is about the individual's role and perspective on culture. So Alexandra was asking, doesn't culture depend on how you perceive it as an individual? And also Susanna was asking, if it's about people, it's psychology. Each person is different, so how do you generalize? Okay, so 2 sort of fairly linked question about the individual, and does sort of a broader organizational culture make sense? Second question comes from Valerie, and this is, I think this is an interesting one. Well, I think they're all interesting, but I like this. We've not talked about this at all. What do the panelists think about the importance of data literacy as a key ingredient of a strong modern culture? Thank you. And then thirdly, and again, this is a double part question. So Peter's been asking, which perspectives and considerations do distributed organizations and remote work add to the topic of organization culture? So how is it different when not everybody is co-located? And we've got a similar linked question from Susanna. How do we build for a remote workplace? So three final questions. Something about the role of the individual in this, data literacy, and remote working organizations. Who would like to go first? Just one answer to one question. Siobhan. Siobhan, I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
I can go on the role of the individual, and essentially, of course, the role of the individual is important, and it's it is an and. But if you think about when you walk into an organization, often there is a role that you're expected to take up. So, for example, I did some work at a consulting firm where they were trying to create a more innovative culture, but actually everybody took up the role of a traditional thinker. So they kept on delivering the same old way of going about things, and clients were asking for something new. But people in that organization as consultants stepped into a safe pair of hands, giving up the same tired old thinking to clients. So we had to reframe the role of the consultants in that firm from traditional thinkers to innovative thinkers. workforce. And that role reframe led to faster change with less noise. So the individual component is there, but the role, that the expectations that the organisation has of you as an employee also impacts, and that's where culture comes into play.
Perfect, wonderful. Stephen or Juan?
I'd like to talk a little bit about the remote culture. I think obviously, I think with what Enrique said at the top of the event today, with the coronavirus has forced people and companies to restrict some of their employee workforce to basically working remotely. So this is like a really in real time example for us. And I think obviously this has to be a topic because it's not only is it cost effective, and I think that's the secondary thing. I think some people just have a preference to work that way. And many companies are having large percentages when they open up the doors to employees to work remotely, they are jumping at the chance. And I think, it might be an introvert, it might be just a specific generation. And I absolutely believe that strong cultures can be developed remotely. And I can say that because of an online cohort that I was a part of through a master's degree program that I had. And we had to be tremendously intentional because our experience was basically within this screen, our interaction with our fellow classmates. And so we were basically so intentional and so focused, and that people who actually straddled the two programs were able to say that the online culture was far better than the in-person culture because of the intentionality behind it. And I think that came from not only the people that were part of that group, it was also the leaders that fostered that type of interaction, but it was also just a group as a whole. So I think we can learn from academics as well as the workforce in ways that we can actually promote some really strong culture and engagement, even if it's just in a virtual workspace.
Okay, wonderful. And Juan, perhaps the data literacy side?
Well, so I'm going to comment on the other one that was part of a double question, the individual. How can you generalize around the individual? And it's going to be a short answer. France, for instance, has 68 million individuals, and each one is unique and perfect as they are. But France, generally, as a country, has a culture that is quite different than England. It is quite different than the U.S. Each of these countries having multiple millions of people who are individual. That's why data analytics, you can not only can see one person's culture, their behavior, again, back to BMW, behaviors, motivators, values, work styles, you can see the team culture rolling it up for 10 people. You can see the culture of a division called finance. You can see the entire country, Coca-Cola France versus Coca-Cola Argentina. So there is patterns, to Siobhan's point, that you can get with data around BMW, the behaviors, the motivators, and the work styles of people and how they come together. And it's all today measurable, and you can have roadmaps, and you can manage culture to align with strategy.
Perfect, wonderful, and thank you for the finish, because we've got sort of 3 or 4 minutes to wrap up. Okay, so I'm going to respond very quickly to your question, Valerie, then about data literacy. Yes, absolutely. Data is more and more important in everything that we do in organisations. Culture just the same. So despite my earlier disagreement, I do think tools like Juan's Humantelligence tools, add an awful lot to all of this conversation. However, I do think I'd go back to what I was saying at the beginning. Culture is more and more important. It's the driver of business success. And culture can be understood better through data, but culture is about understanding people, understanding societies. It's about psychology that a couple of people have been mentioning in the chat. It's about sociology, it's about anthropology, as Britt was going to talk about. So yeah, linking culture to data perfectly, but let's try to make sure that we have more people-oriented cultures as well. Cultures where people are able to be them full selves, to participate as people, and to be able to have real human relationships. That would be my sort of build on that. Right, we are almost done. We have half a minute each, everybody, and I mean half a minute. Any final tips, takeaways for people who have been watching, listening, and where can they get hold of you to find out more information? Siobhan, do you want to go first?
Yeah, people can get hold of me on LinkedIn. I'd strongly encourage HR professionals to lean more into your culture and change roles. You can also find out more about how to do that in my book, The Insider's Guide to Culture Change, which gives you the 4 steps to create a workplace that can deliver, grow, and adapt. So those are 2. LinkedIn is probably the best place to get hold of me.
Perfect. Stephen?
Yes, so you can, folks can find me on LinkedIn. That's the best place to reach out to me. So I'm listed under Steve Chaparro, all lowercase words. In fact, if you disagree with anything I say, I love it. Actually, I want to hear those more than those that agree with me, because I always love learning different perspectives. So Steve Chaparro on LinkedIn.
Perfect. And Juan?
Information about a software that helps you measure, manage, and hire for culture, and align culture to strategy at www.humantelligence.com. There's no IN, it's not intelligent. And then I've also put in the chat group my email there at the end. Feel free to reach out. I'll be happy to do a demo.
Perfect. Wonderful. And for me, I'd encourage people to have a look at my book too. Mine was called The Social Organisation, where I talk about developing capabilities. The whole book is about culture, and I don't mention the word once apart from explaining why I'm not going to talk about it. If you want a little bit more information on that without purchasing the book, the site is organisation.social, organisation with Z, much as I hate doing so. My own site is johningham.com, and I am John Ingham on LinkedIn and Twitter. The John is Jon, so no H in that. And that sort of brings us to the end of the to our panel, at least. Obviously, it's very early days in terms of the rest of the conference. You still have another, was it 2.5 days and a day of workshops? So plenty more fun and excitement to come. If you're watching live, we do have a panel on employee experience starting in 15 minutes time. And then after another half an hour, we've got Gary Hamill talking about leading organizations in the new world of work. So plenty more to look forward to later on. But well, firstly, thank you for everybody who's been chatting and for all of your questions and other points. That's made our panel much more interesting and made our jobs easy. So thank you for that. And thank you for all our 3 other panelists for joining and sharing all of your insights. It's been wonderful talking to you, and yeah, look forward to catching up another time. Thanks very much, everybody. All the best.